What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're taking a look at a random YouTube apologist who thinks that he can show how atheism and naturalistic materialism are both invalid, and he's gonna use the rules of logic in order to do it. So if you heathens want to fuck around and find out how atheism and naturalism are both illogical and are easily refuted, then please stay tuned.
I promised an atheist that I was going to present to him some evidence about the existence of God. And the reason why I am even indulging this individual, and I apologize to you, sir or ma'am, if I sound a little bit condescending, it's just my way of speaking. I'm sorry, just putting it out there right now.
I mean, going ahead and apologizing for being condescending doesn't really detract from being condescending. It just means that you're aware that you're condescending, you just don't care. In any case, I'm excited to hear why you think that atheism and naturalistic materialism are illogical or invalid. I don't really know how he phrases it. Let's find out.
So I'm going to be talking about the inviability of atheism and the self-refutation of naturalistic materialism, and then I'm going to give you evidence for the existence of God. Okay? So first of all, atheism is inviable. Why? Because atheism is indefensible. The word atheism is the negative, and theist or theism, meaning negative, no, negative, meaning no God. An atheist, by definition, makes the statement, there is no God.
Well, you see, right there is where you're fucking up. Because while there are some atheists out there that do say there is no God, I would say that that's only a subset of the atheist demographic that would make that particular statement. Now, I make that particular statement about specific definitions of God, like Yahweh. Yahweh does not exist, or there is no God named Yahweh is how I would probably phrase that. But as far as a general idea of God, and as far as atheism is concerned, I would say that I just simply don't believe in any gods. That's, at the bare minimum, what it means to be an atheist. It's about not believing in a God, not knowing whether or not a God exists, or making positive claims or statements about the existence of God. It's just your own personal belief about there not being a God, how you don't believe in a God specifically. So it kind of seems like this guy is starting off from a straw man, because he's painting atheism and atheists in an incorrect light, even etymologically speaking, because theism is actually the belief in a God, specifically a personal God that maintains some kind of connection with its adherents. But in theism, it's just the belief in that God that theism characterizes. So if you attach an A on the front of that, atheism, it just means someone that doesn't believe in God, specifically the personal kind of God. But that's, if you were to go etymologically speaking, that's how you would interpret the word atheism, not how this guy right here has done it. The way that he has done it, he's forced this other kind of definition onto theism, which is God does exist. It's more of a philosophical statement, whereas the majority of atheists out there don't use atheism or theism as philosophical statements. It's more of a description of whether or not the person believes or doesn't believe in a God. So if you start off from that straw man, you're only really attacking a small subset of the conversation instead of the actual conversation that everybody in general is having.
Because that's what the word means. Atheism means no God. There is no God.
No, the label atheism or atheism or the label atheist just simply means not believing in a God, because that's how fucking words work.
So if you turn the word atheism into an adjective describing a person, then the person who's an atheist is a man or a woman who does not...
Oh shit, yo, you fucked yourself up, didn't you there, bud? It's a person that does not, what is it? Believe in God? Please tell me those are the next couple words out of your mouth. Does not believe in God. Come on, you can do it. It's really simple.
Negate or reject the position there is no God. Or rather, that individual purports, supports, and proclaims the statement and position, there is no God. However,
he was so close, but he had to stop and think about how to word it. In any case, no, that's obviously not what atheism or atheists are sitting there trying to do. He almost made it, but he had to reword himself a little bit there and actually, communicate what he initially stated atheism was. But in any case, that's obviously not what atheism or atheists is meant to convey. So, I mean, he's only attacking like the hard atheist position, which, I mean, there are good arguments for the hard atheist position. I don't hold that position myself, but if you're talking about attacking atheism in general, I think that you should just stick to whether or not somebody believes in God and showing how that's illogical. And the way that you would do that is to provide evidence of God. Now, at the beginning of this, he mentioned how he was going to provide evidence of God, but that's going to come in part 2 of this video. So stick around for that later on in the year. But that's how you would prove that atheism is like a bad position or an illogical position, or basically refute atheism, is by showing evidence that a God does exist. It's not internally inconsistent, just not believing in a God. I feel like you have to make compelling arguments for a God's existence because the natural position or the initial position of the God question is kind of neutral, like whether or not God exists, I don't know. Where's the evidence for it?
It's inviable. Why? Because in order for you to be an atheist, you have to have all knowledge.
No, you don't have to have all knowledge. I mean, I don't have all knowledge, but I also don't believe in unicorns or leprechauns or, rainbow walkways to, or however that happened in The Wizard of Oz. Wasn't there a rainbow in Wizard of Oz? Yeah, there was a rainbow. I feel like the way that he's going about it's gonna bite him in the ass, because if he's gonna require all knowledge in order to say that either something does not exist or to just not believe in some kind of proposition or claim out there, then his position is no more representative of reality than my position. So we just find ourselves on the exact same playing field yet again, except he doesn't really have a good position on this particular field.
You cannot, from a philosophical perspective, prove a negative. You can't prove a negative. I'll tell you why.
Well, before we get to his why, we don't have to prove a negative. See, this is a shifting of the burden of proof. Atheists don't have to prove there is no God. It's up to theists out there to prove that there is a God, and specifically that their God is the one God or one of the gods that does exist. Atheists simply just don't believe in any of the gods that we currently know about. And then if you want to get more specific into agnostic and Gnostic, that's a little bit more complicated of a discussion, which we'll get to in the next video when I respond to his evidence of God. But atheists don't have to prove a negative because we're not making a positive claim. Theists are making the positive claim that a God does exist. We're just saying, where's your proof? And I don't believe it until you show me proof.
In regards to God, you cannot hold the position there is no God because you have not been in all places at all times at the same time.
Well, you could turn this around on this individual right here and say, how do you know that your God is the one true and real God? You don't have all knowledge. So you don't know that your God is the one true God, or more specifically, in order to make it a bit more analogous to the atheist position, he can't say that any other religion out there is not representative of reality. He can't say, oh, those gods don't exist, because he doesn't have all knowledge. Of course, he could appeal to his God having all knowledge, and his God communicated that through his holy book, which is kind of odd considering his holy book, he's a Christian, by the way, his holy book doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence because it has so many different things wrong with it. Like it's got a lot of ahistorical things in it. It's got a lot of ascientific things in it. It's a mess. But the fact is that he can no more say that other gods don't exist than I can say his God doesn't exist or other definitions of God don't exist.
You have never been in all places at all times in the universe, in the world, to see that there is no evidence for God.
We can ask for evidence, and if you can't provide that evidence, then there's no reason for us to believe it. Recently, we did that video, that director's cut on Russell's teapot, and I think that that's very appropriate here because this guy right here isn't everywhere like his God supposedly is. He doesn't know everything, and so there's no way for him to know, like he's requiring me to know, that there's not a teapot that is orbiting the sun between, Mars and Earth. So, I mean, his whole epistemology here for how he knows that his God is real or that God does exist and how atheists are illogical or invalid, as he said at the beginning, is just flawed because he can't actually say this doesn't exist or that doesn't exist. He seems to not understand the ramifications of the argument that he's making.
Hence the inviability of atheism. It cannot be defended. It cannot be true. It's false. The position of atheism is false.
I don't know if atheism absolutely is true or false, like hard atheism, that is, because that's what he's talking about. Whether or not a God exists, I don't know. I would be an agnostic on that particular question, but for all intents and purposes, I call myself an atheist because I don't believe that any God does exist. It hasn't been debunked, and this particular argument that he's presenting here, he's basically presenting an unfalsifiable argument, saying that, well, because you don't know everything, therefore you can't say God doesn't exist. And that puts him in a precarious position, like I said before, because he can't say Krishna doesn't exist, or Zoroastrianism, the god of Zoroastrianism, that one doesn't exist, or that Zeus doesn't exist. Like, he can't make those kind of determinations. He can't say those things, especially in the Old Testament, the Israelites, they believed that there were multiple gods that existed, like Baal and Molech, and all of those other gods that, like, other Canaanites and other civilizations worship. So he can't say that those things don't exist due to his argument. And that's the problem with his argument.
You cannot prove a negative. So you have to throw the word atheism out the door, and you have to throw that identifier of yourself out the door, because you're not an atheist. Because if you were an atheist, you would have all knowledge. And you don't have all knowledge, therefore you're not an atheist. See the indefensibility of atheism? See the inviability of atheism? Atheism is just indefensible and inviolable.
I don't really see it as that, even from a hard atheist position, mainly because if you present a straw man argument against the position, I feel like that puts you in a weaker spot. Like, there's no reason for me to think that there's no reason for me to think that his argument has really affected the atheist position in any kind of sense, because he's not really describing the atheist position. He's attacking this easier to knock down position, and for me, that's just underwhelming.
Secondly, naturalistic materialism. Every atheist that I've met, every atheist I've encountered, is a naturalistic materialist. It is the rejection of the supernatural and the proclamation or the contention that only the material world exists.
Well, considering that we know that the material world exists, at least for all intents and purposes of us interacting with our reality and everything of that nature, I mean, yes, the material world exists. We can provide empirical evidence within the material world, within the material reality, and we can support conclusions that we come to based on how reality operates. And, we don't know how reality operates in all areas of reality, but, we're getting closer and closer every day. So as far as saying, what does exist in reality, or what is in existence right now, we have to appeal to what we can actually sense and what we can actually determine to be real. And we can do that through the use of the scientific method that requires empirical evidence. Empirical evidence would not include supernatural evidence or miracles or anything like that. So yeah, I agree with naturalistic materialism. More specifically, methodological naturalism is the position that I hold, that I think is representative of how our reality works. So I feel like me saying, look, everything that I can see, hear, and detect in general, not just with our own limited five senses, but with other ways of determining things in this reality, those things are real, and these supernatural and magical things are not. And this guy in this video is saying, oh, that's fucking stupid. Why would you think magic's not real?
And everything is governed by the laws of nature and the laws of physics. Now watch this. Here's the problem with that. If everything is guided and directed by natural laws, laws of physics, then your brain, your thoughts, when you talk, when you think, all that's happening is one chemical reaction leading to another chemical reaction, which means that in every situation where all things are equal and identical, you would say the same thing, think the same thing, and do the same thing every single time, because that is how your brain does its chemical reactions.
I mean, yeah, if you could repeat an event with all the exact same inputs, I feel like the event would play out exactly the same. Like, if you replayed an event and had no external input into the repetition of that event, and that event just repeats without any change, then it's going to be the same event. I don't see how this is like ridiculous. Also, at the very beginning of this, he said that the laws of physics and nature are what guide or direct things. And I feel like that's kind of imparting and sort of begging the question here, but that's imparting some kind of sentience on nature or the natural world. And there is no sentience in the natural world. The natural world just operates. There's no like direction or guidance. It operates based on what we perceive as these laws. We have formulated these laws in order to describe how nature operates. And these laws are based on observations, repeatable observations that we've been able to make and verify, outside of our own subjective experience. I don't see how this is like a crazy thing to suggest here, that nature is just gonna nature. I mean, that's exactly what nature does. It doesn't need a sentient being or anything like that in order to operate. And he's sitting over here laughing about it like, oh, brain chemistry. If you're telling me if we could reset time and let events play out, they'll just play out how they would have played out the first time and the time after that, all the way to n+1 into infinity. Like, if there's no other input, like if there's no change to it, then yeah, it's gonna stay the same. I don't see how this is like laughable. Also, I feel like he's more or less laughing about the notion that our brains are chemically based and based on like the laws of chemistry, the laws of physics, and all this other stuff that go into these complex interactions that happen in our neurochemistry. And I find it laughable that he's laughing at just basic scientific facts here, because what that means is, and this is why I find it funny, is that he thinks that there's something magical about the brain. He was, lamenting earlier about how naturalism just, disregards supernatural things or magical things. And so if he's laughing about how our brains operate, how we know them to operate, then the only other option, it seems, at least for him, is that our brains work magically. Like there's some kind of magical dust that's floating around in our brains that makes it operate. Or that there's some sentient being out there, again, begging the question, that there's some sentient being out there causing us to have brains that operate in a certain way. Like, I don't understand why it's funny to pit magic up against, like, shit that you can actually quantify. You can't quantify magic. You can't quantify the neurochemistry that goes on in our brains. I don't know. It's hilarious to me that he's laughing at basic scientific facts.
So I could easily say, you're an atheist, or rather you think you're an atheist, because that is how your brain's chemical reaction determined you to believe or determined you to identify as.
Well, I feel like reducing complex thoughts and the consciousness of humankind to just how the neurochemistry works in order for those emergent properties in our complex central nervous system to make themselves like apparent. I feel like boiling it down to that is really missing out on the complex interactions that actually occur. It also misses out on the feedback that we get as people. Like we do have this neurochemistry that happens, and our actions are guided by this neurochemistry that happens in our brains, but we do have this feedback loop where we do things in reality and then we get this feedback, and then that changes how our neurochemistry works. We're constantly changing in that way. So by him reducing it down to just chemical reactions, fizzy, pop, pop, and explaining it that way and making it sound ridiculous, I feel like is just not really grasping the complexities of the human brain. He's not also taking into account the inputs that people receive from their environment, from their societies, from the culture, which would be part of the society, but you know, the culture that they live in. So, I mean, there's complex interactions that are happening here. It's not just fizzy, pop over here. I mean, there are complex chemical things that are happening as well as input that we receive from the environment.
Now, here's why naturalistic materialism is self-refuting. Here's why. Because one chemical reaction in someone's brain leading to another chemical reaction in someone's brain cannot produce proper logical inference.
Citation fucking needed for this particular statement, because again, distilling human thoughts or the human brain and the brain chemistry of humans down to just chemicals interacting is really negating all of the not only feedback but other kind of inputs that we receive. To say that, oh, we can't make these logical inferences, you would have to sit there and show me how that can not happen, because it obviously has. Our brains do work by neurochemistry. And for as much as we can tell, there's no magic that's floating around in there in our brains. And our personalities are definitely tied to the physiology of our brains, as has been shown in different ways, like how our brains can get affected, like portions of our brains get affected, and whole personalities will change and everything like that. So we know those things are real. We have quantifiable evidence for it, but what we don't have quantifiable evidence for is this idea that our brains, being chemically based, can't make logical inferences. He has no evidence that would suggest this.
And we know that logic exists. We use it all the time to communicate. I'm using logic right now.
No, you're not using logic right now. Like, whatever's the opposite of logic, that's what you're using. Fucked up logic. It's F logic. Basically this video is just like, fuck logic! Defeated atheism.
There are three laws of logic: law of non-contradiction, law of identity, and law of excluded middle. Law of identity: something is what it is and is not what it is not. Law of excluded middle: something is either true or false, there is no middle ground. Law of non-contradiction: something cannot be true and false in the same sense, in the same way. These laws are used every single day in the way we talk, in the way we act, in the way we interact, all the time.
Well, right, but I can sit there and describe a hammer and, describe each particular part of the hammer, the concept behind the hammer, and I can still use it to like open up my car door by smashing the window in. Now, is that the proper way to use a hammer or open up a car door? Fuck no. So just because you can recite, like you reading it out of a book, the laws of logic, doesn't mean you know how to correctly apply them. Like, for instance, the law of excluded middle. That really only applies to a true dichotomy. But if you have a complex question that can have multiple answers, answers, then your law of excluded middle is not exactly going to apply to the answer of that question. Now, if you prove that one particular answer is false, that doesn't automatically mean that all the other answers are true or only one of the potential other answers is true. What you have to do is find a true dichotomy. Like, for instance, this apple is either red or it's not red. Which one is it? It could be a picture of an apple that we have modified with different colors so that it presents differently. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's green or any other color, it just means that it's not red. And more specifically to this video, he suggested a violation of the law of identity earlier when he was talking about, oh, how ridiculous it is that if everything was equal and you replayed events or you replayed a decision, you would make the same decision because that's how you operate chemically. And he's sitting there saying that, oh, this event right here, if you duplicate it and it's the exact same event, then it could be different. Like, in his magical world, the event could play out in a different way if you duplicate it. And so that seems to violate a law of logic. So, do I think that people can violate laws of logic? Obviously. This motherfucker is. But that doesn't mean that the laws of logic can't be used in order to determine, reasonable discourse or reasonable conclusions. We can still use those laws of logic to determine if someone's being unreasonable. Like this fuck right here.
Guess what? Do you know what my question is?
I have no fucking clue as to what your question is there, bud. Could you, get to the fucking point?
I think you probably know. Where did the laws of logic come from?
Oh, okay, good. I'm so glad you asked. Well, the laws of logic are a description of what we have observed of reality. So where did the laws of logic come from? Human beings. We created the laws of logic. Now, those laws of logic are crafted in order to describe reality in the ways that it does. And humans of the past have collaborated and corroborated each other on these laws of logic. What this guy described were the classical laws of logic, and this is what our modern sense of logic is built off of. We have actually added to this classical sense of logic by adding symbolic logic, predicate logic and quantification, modal logic, non-classical logic, which would include topics like fuzzy logic, where we actually discuss degrees of truth, and then mathematical logic and mathematical logic does owe a lot to these classical laws of logic, but it has also evolved in different ways. So have we changed our understanding of logic since the classical 3 laws of logic were developed? Yes. And once we begin to understand more and more of our reality, we will continue to change these laws of logic. Under his particular worldview, though, there's just some cloud of magic up here that contains all the logic, and we're just, discovering these laws of logic as God allows it, I guess. Or maybe he just doesn't understand how logic has expanded since the classical laws had been developed.
If the answer is this, they came from our brains. How did the laws of logic come from the brains of people who all they are just reacting, or rather acting out, one chemical reaction that leads to another chemical reaction that leads to another chemical reaction, and every single brain is a different brain. So how come all these different brains that are fizzing differently, how is it that all of these different brains come to a uniform conclusion as to what the laws of logic are?
I like how his brain seems to be hurting right here. Like, he's really having to think hard about this shitty fucking argument he's presenting. And it's causing a migraine. Buddy, I feel for you. Pop an Excedrin. But in any case, how could the laws of logic come about if all we are fizzy fizzy pop pop or sizzle fizzle pop? I don't know what in the fuck however fuck you want to pronounce it there. Again, this also suffers from the same problem that he had earlier in this argument. He's distilling how our brains work down to this just basic chemistry, and he's negating any potential input that may be received. He's also ignoring the fact that we get input from our culture, from other people, and we ourselves are changed as well as our societies, and everything changes over time, and we develop these things not in isolation but as a collective effort. And so what do we have to say say, oh, this is a good law of logic right here. Like, this represents reality. Well, you would have reality in which to compare it to. And if ever these laws don't describe reality in the ways that we would expect it to, then we would change those laws of logic, or we would add on to them rather, which is exactly what we've done. I mean, it's not like the laws of logic came about, you know, however long ago, and they just stayed the same and they never changed. Now, some of the laws never changed, but did logic ever change? Yes, logic has changed. We have developed new laws of logic and new areas of logic in which to describe. So, I mean, to sit there and act like it's sort of done in isolation, or that we have no external reference in which to validate or verify these laws of logic with, it's just ignoring reality itself, which seems to be the thing that Christian apologists love to do. Ignore fucking reality.
And how is it not wrong for all of the brains in this world, the billions of brains in this world, the billions of different brains in this world, how is it wrong if every single one of these different brains came up with different laws of logic? How is it wrong?
Well, it would be wrong if they didn't represent reality, but if the rules or the laws of logic that they come up with do represent reality better, or they sort of complete our view of logic more so than the set of logic that we had before, then we would incorporate that. See, that's how the scientific method fucking works. So we incorporate new information, and we use that new information in order to understand our reality. So you're asking, like, how would you know if your particular set of laws of logic are real or are representative of reality? Compare it to reality. Do these laws of logic make accurate predictions, or allow you to make accurate predictions about reality? Do they describe reality? If they don't, then they're no good. I mean, it's really that fucking simple.
How is it wrong? It could be wrong. What if my law of logic is that we can just contradict each other all day, every day, and there is no law of non-contradiction, but rather there is a law of contradiction? What if I say there is no law of excluded middle? Something can be true and false at the same time in the same sense. There is a middle ground to either true or false. There is no law of identity. What if my brain fizzed those chemical reactions and those thoughts of mine came out, and your brain fizzed that there is a law of logic of non-contradiction, excluded middle, and identity? None of us are wrong. Our brains are just fizzing different chemicals, and we're reacting to the chemical reactions in our brain, and we're saying what we're saying because our brain determined us to say what we're saying and do what we do.
A little bit of a gish gallop here, but I feel like you basically just described the Republican, or rather conservative party right now. I mean, that is what they're operating on, and trust me when I say that they are ridiculous, because their particular set of beliefs do not match to reality. It's very obvious by the fact that a whole bunch of conservatives were waiting for JFK to return from the dead, and JFK Jr. also to return from the dead. I believe at one point the idea was JFK was going to return from the dead, and he was going to be president, and Trump was going to be his vice president, and then JFK was going to hand off the presidency to Donald Trump, which is not how that would happen. And then Donald Trump would then have JFK Jr. as his vice president, and like there were maybe 100 or so people waiting in Dallas, Texas, waiting for JFK to roll down the street. That's exactly what you just described there. Like, if my brain fizzed in such a way that I was a conservative, that's where I'd be, waiting for a fucking dead man to come back to life, stroll down the street and announce that he is president. You can identify how ridiculous that is by how much it differs from the reality of the situation. I feel like the exact same thing can happen for anybody that's posing, like, laws of logic that just contradict reality. I mean, obviously, if the person doesn't believe in contradictions, that's not going to be a problem for them, but it's definitely going to end up being a problem when they meet up with something that is either going to hurt them or is just not going to work out their way. Of course, the MAGA people, they have ways of getting around, all of that and still have this functioning, like, belief system about Donald Trump and conservatism and all this other kind of shit. But my point is that those particular far right-wing people are doing exactly what this guy is talking about here. And everybody can recognize how ridiculous it is because it's so far from reality, it's easy to spot.
And another thing, how is it wrong for someone to, how is it wrong for someone to sexually assault someone else? How is it wrong? That is just how his or her brain chemically fizzed, and the other individual who, in his or her brain, chemically fizzed that they don't like what's happening to them. How is it wrong? How do we determine right from wrong?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, but it's really outside of naturalism here because, I mean, we're talking about the complex interactions within a society, how to best govern a society. So, I mean, he's trying to distill all this down to just the chemicals that are interacting in our brains, and he's looking for some kind of moral absolutes or moral meaning in this chemical reaction. But where we look for morals or the moral foundations and everything like that are much higher up, like in the interactions between individuals and the best ways in order to govern a society. Like that's what's governing those particular interactions, and how we determine what is right or wrong is through considering all of those type of subjects, not just how our brains work. I mean, we can describe how our brains work, but that does not do anything to describe the complex interactions between ourselves and our fellow man and our reality. I can say that sexually assaulting somebody else is wrong because I place a high value on protecting the innocent, you know, what's best for society, what's best for each individual person. I put a high value on attaining happiness so that I'm happy. Everybody's, fine with it. Nobody is hurt. The least amount of hurt. I feel like I'm getting there. The least amount of hurt, attaining as much happiness with the least amount of hurt that you can. I feel like that's a perfectly fine way to determine moral rights and wrongs. But you ultimately have to have some kind of end goal in order to make these moral justifications. Do you understand now how we're so far past how your brain works? Because we're talking about complex interactions between people now, and complex interactions between societal systems. We're not talking about fucking brain chemistry.
But let me get to the refutation. The refutation is this. This is the refutation. Naturalistic materialism is false because all of our brains come to a uniform conclusion about the laws of logic that are immaterial, that are eternal, that are objective. Therefore, naturalistic materialism cannot be true because it is an external objective that we apply to, and there is no external objectives in the naturalistic materialistic world. But since there are objectives and laws of logic, then naturalistic materialism is false.
Well, this is just wrong because it commits a fallacy called begging the question. He assumes his conclusion before arguing his way to his conclusion. It's a form of circular logic here because he assumes that there's some kind of external foundation or external source or anything like that. He assumes this, and then he starts arguing saying, this is wrong over here because we have these things that are all pointing to a sentient being that's external to us, or some kind of external force that's guiding it, or something like that. Do you understand how it's kind of circular logic at this point? He's automatically assuming that there are these external objectives, and he's automatically assuming that we can't objectively verify that the laws of logic comport with reality. He's totally negating the possibility that there are perfectly fine naturalistic explanations for the laws of logic and anything else he would have a question about. He has to do that. He has to ignore information in order to make the argument for his God, and he has to start from the position that his God exists. That's where he's starting from. That's where he's fucking up. He's begging the question in order to try to convince you that his God exists. And I don't think that people should be convinced by fallacious arguments.
So atheism is false. Naturalistic materialism is false. The whole position has to be thrown out the door. The baby and the bathwater has to go. and these claims have to be thrown out.
No, these claims do not have to be thrown out, and atheism and naturalistic materialism or methodological naturalism have not been debunked by his poor grasp of the laws of logic or how our brains work. Or for that matter, anthropology, any kind of societal science like social science, any kind of science that deals with the complex interactions of human beings in a group or a society. I feel like just because he doesn't grasp those concepts all that well does not mean that the laws of logic are useless under naturalistic materialism or methodological naturalism. Basically, he wants you to believe that, there's magic out there. Magic is what guides our lives. Come on, guys, let's get fucking magical. Just because he thinks that magic exists doesn't mean that atheism is debunked or anything like that. The only thing that he has is to presuppositionally assume that his God exists and maintains all of reality through his will, through his wants, and whatever in the fuck, however God is supposed to do that in this guy's magical worldview. He has to assume that without proving it. And then he starts from that assumption in order to prove that his God exists and every other answer is bunk. But I think that I've shown in this video that he commits logical fallacies all the way throughout. He uses straw man fallacies, he uses circular arguments, he uses arguments from incredulity, he uses begging the question arguments. It's just really bad all throughout. I think this guy needs to go back, rethink his positions, think about the ramifications of his epistemological claims, and basically how we come to know certain things, or the methods that he uses to know them, because the methods that he presented here in this video are only going to hurt him in an argument, because now he can't say that any other belief position or any other non-belief position is false, because he is in not a position because he's not in a position where he knows everything. So he can't know if Zeus isn't real, or if Nostradamus wasn't a prophet or a psychic, or, or the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, or leprechauns don't exist. Let's go full 9. Unicorns don't exist. He can't tell you that unicorns don't exist because he doesn't have all knowledge. He doesn't know everything. He wasn't everywhere in order to see everything. Of course, he would claim to have a book that tells him about it. And I guess it really depends on how much stock you want to put in that book, which is what we're going to cover next time when we see this guy, because he's got some evidence for God, and I bet you that it's as fallaciously fucked as this video was. That's all for his video. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you thought about it. Do you think that he had a lot of fallacies in it like I found, or do you think that he's making some good points here? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.